He's been called Putin's attack dog. Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, has sent his feared troops into Ukraine. Since then, Kadyrov has posted a stream of videos from the front lines on social media showing soldiers allegedly participating in military activities on Ukrainian territory. But could this intervention prove Kadyrov's undoing? Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Ramzan Kadyrov is one of the most feared men in Russia and one of the most popular figures on Russia's social media sites. Kadyrov, who rules Russia's Chechnya Republic with an iron fist, is a former rebel turned Kremlin ally with a paramilitary force at his command. His 30,000-strong security force, known as Kadyrovsky, are frequently documented in Kadyrov's Telegram channel and on Russian social media, racking up millions of views. The warlord's digital diary offers an insight into the fighting, but some analysts say evidence of actual bravery on the battlefield is lacking, with the Chechen presence being nothing more than a public relations display aimed at boosting the position of both Kadyrov and the Kremlin. So, what is the Chechen role in Ukraine, and could their involvement in Russia's operation backfire on the Chechen leader? So here are today's guests. In London, we have Aglaya Snetkov, a lecturer in international politics at University College London. In Glasgow, Harold Chambers, analyst on conflict, nationalism and security in the North Caucasus. In Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, we have Munira Mustaffa, a non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute. Good to have all of you with us. Aglaya, let me start with you. There's a little bit of confusion over what Chechen fighters are doing in Ukraine. We're hearing they were part of the first wave of attacks. Is that your understanding?
Yes. So in terms of the Chechen troops, the understanding was that Kadyrov was very happy to send them in at the outset, supported the military operation straight away. There's a question mark as to the extent to which the Kadyrov troops have seen fighting and been engaged in fighting. But there was evidence of them being around Kiev, Mariupol, and other locations.
And of course, using Chechen fighters is consistent with Putin's past policies, right? Because they've been involved in other conflicts involving the Russian army, including Ukraine 6 or 7 years ago.
Absolutely. Kadyrov was very keen to show military support to the Russian forces in Ukraine in 2014, also Georgia 2008, and Syria. So the Chechen forces have been regularly deployed alongside the Russian forces.
Harold, what's your understanding of what Chechen fighters are doing in Ukraine? What is their mission? What is their goal?
So from the beginning, their goal is very much more of a psychological warfare, in addition to conventional objectives such as assassinating Ukrainian top leadership. However, they obviously failed on that objective on the Kiev front, and they have not yet been successful on the Mariupol front, especially with regards to taking the Azovstal metallurgy plant. So far, again, their involvement with actual combat is questionable. However, they're certainly recording a lot of videos, and as more evidence comes out related to the war crimes, we'll understand more about what they've actually been doing.
Yeah, we'll talk about their propaganda, their social media in just a minute. I'm really interested in your use of psychological warfare, because the one thing we can say about Chechen fighters is they have this reputation of being absolutely brutal fighters. And is that one of the reasons that they're in Ukraine, to this kind of psychological threat against Ukrainians?
Absolutely. That is one of the reasons why they were the most promoted force in the military buildup, especially once they were mobilized at the beginning of February. However, the big problem is that their reputation does not match their actual operational capabilities. And this is partially because of a very concerted domestic propaganda campaign run by Kadyrov, targeting the Kremlin to sort of promote his fighters as the most elite, the top force in Russia.
Munira, there's no doubt that they are waging this social media campaign, this propaganda campaign. There are frequent posts to social media sites, and we know Kadyrov himself is posting very frequently. What is that about? Who is that for?
It's for his audience. My understanding is that the Kadyrovites are set as a support to the Russian troops. That's one. And for the other, I think that there's also the element of overestimating their capabilities, because what he's doing is that he's sending a troop that's equipped with SWAT-style kind of combat into an actual military battlefield, and it's not going to match. And of course, he's going to supplement that as well with a propaganda-driven message to his audience to put up this image that the Chechen troops can measure up in the battlefield.
So this is about boosting his image inside Chechnya and also boosting the prowess, for want of a better word, of Chechen fighters. Is that also to try and encourage young Chechen men to join the fight? Because I understand that he's been trying to drum up support for more and more volunteers.
Kadyrov has been known to socialize the Chechen youth into the militarized mobilization. And that's where part of his fight club culture comes into play as well, because that's a lot where he's recruiting them as well. He's mining the membership there to recruit and groom young Chechen fighters and join his troops.
And Harold, I can see you nodding there. Is that your perception as well?
So I completely agree that there's definitely a grooming atmosphere towards moving from the fight clubs into the Kadyrovs. However, in terms of actually recruiting people to go to Ukraine, it seems to be a lot more of a struggle. There are reports of police literally just stopping people on the roads to try to bribe them, essentially, to come and fight. He's done a lot of sort of show deployments of pretending that units are, we're ready to deploy, but they're not actually deploying. Also, one of his commanders returned to Chechnya, and it was rumored that he tried to get recruits from his own home village, and they turned him down. So in terms of actually recruiting, it seems to be a much more of a struggle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about Ramzan Kadyrov. Who is he? What his relationship is with Russia? According to political commentator Konstantin von Eggert, he says the role of Kadyrov since he became president has been to show loyalty to Putin and to serve as a boogeyman, a constant threat to Putin's enemies. Aglaya, Kadyrov has been referred to as Putin's pet warlord, as Putin's attack dog. Is that how Putin uses him?
So I think there's definitely been an interesting relationship that has sort of developed between Putin and Kadyrov. It's a very personal relationship. So Kadyrov regime relies on Putin being in Moscow. And I think after the death of Kadyrov the Elder, Putin sort of replaced that figurehead when it comes to Kadyrov. Kadyrov has definitely been used, and Chechen sort of officers have definitely been used as attack dogs, also to eliminate people for the regime. But at the same time, I think we have to keep in mind that, that relationship has always been there's always been concern as to how viable it is, how enduring it will be. But I think it's definitely clear that the Putin regime relies on Kadyrov being in Chechnya, and sort of Kadyrov in turn relies on Putin being in Moscow.
And just to clarify, I mean, Kadyrov used to be a Kremlin opponent, and then he switched sides. And now he's heavily reliant on Vladimir Putin for his authority in Chechnya. So
technically it was his father who was the first sort of president of Chechnya who had switched sides. And interestingly, in the case of, and the question of Ukraine, when Putin was talking, or where there was discussions to whether or not the Russians wanted to put in a puppet regime in Kyiv, I think that what happened in Chechnya was the example they used. So essentially going in, having a security operation, and then putting in a pro-Russian regime that in the case of Chechnya has survived for over 15 years.
So in January, Kadyrov said his southern Russian regime would not be able to survive a month without Moscow's multi-billion-dollar subsidies. Munira, he is heavily reliant on Russia for his power, his wealth.
That's right. I would say that it's a very symbiotic relationship between Kadyrov and with Putin in particular. And I think it's benefiting each other as well. Because Putin knew that given the power dynamics between them, he's aware that Kadyrov is in no position to betray him. And at the same time, with the permission that Putin has granted him, Kadyrov is able to do whatever he likes in Chechnya. So what's happening here is that it's kind of a symbiotic relationship, and also through that relationship, it allows Putin a possible deniability.
Right. So you're saying that Kadyrov's fighters are a useful tool for Putin because they can go in and do whatever they like and obviously not adhere to the norms of conflict, and Putin can distance himself from that. Is that what you're saying? So
yes,
when we look at the atrocities that are taking place around Mariupol, for example, does that look like something that Chechen fighters might be involved in?
Oh yes, I would say it's quite likely.
Do you agree with that assessment, Harold, that these fighters can be used in a way? I mean, we don't really know what's going on inside, and obviously Russian troops have been accused of atrocities as well. But this gives Putin some distance with fighters who are renowned for their brutality.
Yeah, so the Ukrainian authorities released a couple lists, I think now, of different units that were present in the Kyiv area around the time when these massacres and atrocities were committed. The only Chechen unit on that list is the Syever Battalion. But I mean, in terms of the capability to do it, absolutely. You know, the Kadyrovs themselves frequently get the reputation of being this elite counterinsurgency force, but the truth is that they're not actually good at conventional warfare. They're good at brutalizing civilian populations. And as we move out of Bucha and into other areas, I think we might see more of this. The Chechens were known to be in Borodyanka, where they've just gotten to. They're carrying out large-scale Zachistki sweep operations in Mariupol under the command of Adam Delemhanov, which obviously is where they're now mobile crematoriums. I think this is going to get really bad.
And as to the reason why Kadyrov would deploy his troops, his fighters in the first place, this is a way for Kadyrov to prove his loyalty, right? To prove his loyalty and his usefulness to Vladimir Putin.
I would say so, yes. Kadyrov was also anxious to put his troops into the battlefield. He calls it a decisive assault.
Right. So as far as Kadyrov's concerned, one of the reasons that he wanted to very much get involved is to show to demonstrate his loyalty to the Kremlin. So so it's not a surprise that he sent his troops in. Sorry, Harold, you wanted to say something?
I would specify that it's not a loyalty to the Kremlin, it's a loyalty to Putin. It's a very important distinction. I mean,
right.
In terms of supporters of Kadyrov, it doesn't even extend to Putin's spokesperson here. And so I think this is one of the things to watch, is that Kadyrov became so heavily involved in this invasion to juxtapose himself against other security officials who were not as supportive at the beginning.
So if we look at the question of whether this could backfire on Kadyrov, Aglaya, you said right at the beginning that Kadyrov had underestimated the resistance that the Ukrainians had put up. Did Kadyrov expect this to be as easy as Vladimir Putin expected this to be?
So I think that there's information that, for example, Kadyrov had much more information about the operation than even those in Kremlin. So the intercepted information did seem to suggest that Kadyrov was informed early. Now, something to keep in mind is Kadyrov himself, hasn't actually participated in sort of major war operations. That took place under his father. And sort of since then, he has been playing at this figurehead of, the warlord, the sort of military prowess. But actually, that's not something that he's participated in himself very much. So I think he interestingly did admit that he was surprised at the level of resistance in Ukraine and the poor sort of military Russians had, but he also called for the acceleration of the campaign, and he sort of called to increase the operations and push forward. In that sense, the Kadyrov troops are perhaps better trained, unfortunately, for doing things like sweep operations that we may see them have done than the military operations of the first offensive. They've never participated in those. The type of operations that Chechens participated in that involved war was over 20 years ago. No one on the ground in Ukraine today would have been fighting 20 years ago.
Munira, do you agree with that? That the experience of the kind of warfare that's happening in Ukraine is not necessarily the experience that Chechen fighters have?
This is correct. I would agree so, because we need to distinguish the combat role of military versus the counterinsurgency policing style that Kadyrov's men are more accustomed to.
So, Munira, on this question of how this could impact on Kadyrov back in Chechnya, isn't it the case that he needs his armed security forces around him to maintain his authority? I mean, there's a lot of people in Chechnya who hate him. And so heavy casualties is going to be a big problem for him.
I think Kadyrov is quite well versed enough in social media to be able to obfuscate the facts and try to spin the narrative according to his own version of events.
But in terms of his authority and holding on to power, what is he relying on?
He's still relying on his relationship with Putin. And I think that's probably why Putin has promoted him to the role of Lieutenant General of the Russian Armed Forces.
Harold, what do you think about that? The idea that Chechen troops have gone into a situation that they are not wholly experienced at or equipped for, and B, there are much more heavy casualties than Kadyrov was expecting.
I think they're definitely not performing as they were hoped to perform. And we saw most of Kadyrov's top leadership on the Kiev front. And then they got pulled out. Some of them have been redeployed. Some of them are still missing from action. But the biggest new variable is the fact that Adam Lemhanov was deployed to oversee the Mariupol front. And I mean, that is a big change and really indicates how Kadyrov is feeling about the situation, because Lemhanov is easily his most trusted man. When he wants something organized and he wants something achieved, he goes to Adam Lemhanov.
It's interesting that Kadyrov recently criticized the Russian negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, for being too accommodated in Ukraine. This is what he had to say.
We will make no concessions. It was Mr. Medinsky making a mistake, giving a wrong wording. It wasn't right of him.
So, Aglaya, what do you make of that? Are there some cracks appearing between how Russia is doing this and what Kadyrov wants?
So Kadyrov has clearly criticized a lot of the Kremlin representatives. He has also criticized the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. Kadyrov, in many ways, have been given liberty to say things that others cannot. However, at the same time, Kadyrov has always spoken his mind and has not been representative of what is happening inside Kremlin. He is important to Kremlin, but he's not inherently part of Kremlin. So I think it clearly shows that there are different points of view regarding what's going on and the way in which negotiations, for example, should be taking place. But I'm not sure that this says much about what's going on with the Putin's inner circle, precisely because Kadyrov has always played this sort of somewhat special role in his relationship with Putin.
What's your take on this, Munira? Does Kadyrov have a different agenda? Does he want the war to continue in Ukraine?
Well, he's not the kind of person who would shy away from brutality. I think that he thought he saw the battlefield as an opportunity to exert his importance. But obviously, the whole thing is not going his way.
But is it interesting that he would openly and publicly say that the Russian negotiator had made a mistake? Is it interesting that he would openly disagree with the position the Kremlin is taking?
I think it would make sense for him to say something like that because he would want to make a point to highlight their weaknesses as opposed to his own abilities.
And what do you say, Harold? Is Kadyrov trying to undermine Russia's negotiating team? What's his agenda here?
I mean, I think to a certain extent, yes, he is trying to undermine them. It is to his advantage to continue the war. As long as the war continues, he can continue to create his propaganda videos, which, again, those are for a domestic audience and very heavily an audience of one. And so he can continue to prove his worth to Putin as long as the war continues. We've seen elites rally around the flag, but they're definitely not united. So by trying to stoke some of these tensions, you know, he's still doubling down on his loyalty to Putin and his support for this invasion.
Harold, I just wanted to ask you one quick thing, because it's worth noting there are other Chechen fighters in Ukraine, aren't there, who don't support Kadyrov. Are we going to see some kind of conflict between Chechen units in Ukraine?
I'm not sure if we ever actually will. As far as I know, the Sheikh Mansour battalion is down around, I think, around the Kherson front at the moment. I know they recently linked up with another volunteer battalion down there. The Johar Dudayev battalion, I'm not sure exactly where they're located. The Sheikh Mansour battalion was located in Kiev, with the whole point of promoting a confrontation with the Kadyrovs. Obviously, that did not materialize. Whether it will now is questionable, but it's definitely a factor, maybe not in this conventional war, but definitely in the fact that there is currently a civil war over the identity of who gets to be labeled a Chechen.
Yeah, I was wondering, I don't know whether anyone has a view or knows how Chechens in exile feel about Chechnya's involvement in Ukraine. Munira, do you have any insight on that?
My understanding is that the Sheriff Mazur's battalion has been there since the Donbas war broke out in 2014, fighting alongside Johar Dudayev's battalion. And I think my concern is that given the composition of the actors on the battlefield, it's not going to be fully conventional army, considering that they have like various experiences and various motivations to be there.
What do we think Chechen involvement means for the war in Ukraine as the battle becomes more protracted and Putin suffers ever-increasing sanctions and isolation? Aglaya, how do you see this going?
So I think that we will continue seeing the propaganda TikTok videos. I think the concern would be if the Chechen fighters do become more involved in urban warfare, in sort of Zachistski type operations. Because those are ones that they have been involved in the past. They are very brutal, and that is something to be very concerned about. Something to consider is that Kadyrov is actually very keen to ensure that none of his fighters die in battle. one of the things he has to ensure is that they actually do all come home, because the tens of thousands that are in Ukraine are required at home to sort of guarantee the survival of the regime at home. So I don't think that the Chechen fighters will ever become involved in open conflict in that way. But I think in terms of the Letichki against civilians, I think that is something to look out for.
It's been great speaking with all of you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Roundtable. Aglaya Snetkov, Harold Chambers and Munira Mustaffa, thank you. And don't forget, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye, and thanks for watching.